was it like on the set of Little House on the Prairie? The actress who played Michael Landon's wife says it wasn't as wholesome as it seemed.
Little House on the Prairie was the biggest thing.
For 9 seasons, one small town on network television felt like a second home to millions of American families. Walnut Grove wasn't a real place, but it might as well have been. Every Monday night, viewers gathered around the TV to watch the Ingalls family navigate hardship, heartbreak, and hard-won joy on the American frontier. Then, in February of 1984, the show that had built that home decided to burn it down. Literally. When Little House, The Last Farewell, aired as the unofficial send-off to Little House on the Prairie, audiences didn't get a gentle goodbye. Instead, they watched the entire town of Walnut Grove get packed with dynamite and blown to pieces, building by building, on their television screens. It's one of the most talked-about finales in TV history, and for decades, a rumor has followed it around, that this shocking scene is the reason the show got yanked off the air. That's not quite what happened. But the real story, the one involving Michael Landon's fury at his own network, a set that legally had to be returned to its original condition, a cast held together by loyalty and torn apart by grudges, is arguably even more interesting than the myth. Today we're digging into all of it, why Walnut Grove really got blown up, the feuds and secrets simmering behind the cameras, and the storylines that pushed the boundaries of what a family show was allowed to say. Let's get into it. Little House on the Prairie premiered on NBC in 1974, based on Laura Ingalls Wilder's autobiographical novels about growing up on the American frontier in the late 1800s. On paper, it sounds like a simple period piece. In practice, it became something much bigger, largely because of one man, Michael Landon. Landon had already spent over a decade as a heartthrob on Bonanza, before stepping into the role of Charles Ingalls. But on Little House, he wasn't just the leading man. He wrote a huge share of the scripts, directed dozens of episodes, and ran the show as executive producer. That level of control was almost unheard of for a network star at the time, and it meant that nearly every creative decision on Little House ran through him first. That control is a big part of why the show didn't feel like typical 1970s family television. Little House regularly dealt with subjects other family dramas avoided entirely: death, alcoholism, disability, racism, sexual violence, and grief. Episodes didn't always wrap up neatly. Sometimes characters made peace with loss instead of overcoming it. That willingness to sit in discomfort, rather than rush toward a tidy resolution, is a big reason the show is still remembered as more than just wholesome nostalgia. By the early 1980s, though, the ratings that had kept Little House among the most watched programs on television for years began to slide. Audience tastes were shifting, newer shows were pulling viewers away, and after 9 seasons, NBC decided it was time to close the book. Landon, however, wasn't interested in a quiet exit. NBC gave him room to write the ending on his own terms, and what he came up with became legendary. The story that became Little House, The Last Farewell, is deceptively simple. A ruthless land developer arrives in Walnut Grove and, through a legal loophole, manages to claim ownership of the entire town. The residents fight back, but they lose in court. Rather than hand their homes over to a man they despise, the townspeople make a decision. If they can't keep Walnut Grove, no one gets to have it. One by one, families pack their own homes and businesses with dynamite. The schoolhouse, the mill, the mercantile, buildings that had anchored nearly a decade of storytelling, are wired up and detonated in front of the whole town, and in front of millions of viewers watching at home. The residents then march out of Walnut Grove singing a hymn, leaving nothing behind but rubble for the man who thought he'd won. What made the scene land so hard wasn't special effects trickery. The buildings really were destroyed. The demolition happened during the filming of a TV movie called The Last Farewell, rather than during a regular weekly episode, but the explosions themselves were real pyrotechnics detonated on the actual standing sets that the cast and crew had worked on for years. 2 structures were deliberately spared. The Ingalls' own Little House was left standing because of how iconic it had become to the show's identity, and the town church was left untouched as well. As Melissa Gilbert later explained, blowing up a church would have carried an unwanted symbolic weight, essentially reading as an act of hatred rather than defiance, so the production consciously chose to leave it intact as a quieter gesture of peace instead. For the people who had spent years of their lives on that lot, watching it come down for real hit differently than any scripted death or departure ever had. Cast members have described the shoot as feeling less like a workday and more like a funeral. It's easy to see why. These weren't just sets. They were where actors grew up, where friendships were forged, and where an entire fictional community had lived, in the audience's imagination, for the better part of a decade. Here's where the popular myth and the real story start to diverge. For years, the tale passed around by fans was that NBC or the studio ordered the demolition, or that Landon detonated the set purely out of spite toward the network that canceled him. There's some truth buried in there, but the fuller picture is more practical than dramatic. Producer Kent McCrary, who worked on Little House throughout its run, has explained that the arrangement to use the land in Newhall, California came with strings attached from the start. The production had made a deal with the property's owners, and as part of that deal, the land was supposed to be returned to its original, undeveloped condition once filming wrapped for good. In other words, the sets were never going to survive the show's ending regardless of how the story concluded. Someone was going to have to clear that land one way or another. Landon, characteristically, decided that if the buildings had to come down, he would be the one who got to decide how and why. Rather than have a demolition crew quietly bulldoze the town after the cameras stopped rolling, he wrote the destruction directly into the story, turning a logistical necessity into a dramatic, symbolic farewell. He told the New York Times in 1984 that he wanted the ending to double as catharsis, a strong pioneer ending, as he described it, and one last shared experience for a cast and crew who had spent years together on that same patch of land. There was also, by his own admission, a more personal motive layered underneath the practical one. Landon didn't want to see Walnut Grove show up as a recycled backdrop in someone else's production, or watch the sets slowly rot into disrepair once the show wrapped. Destroying the town guaranteed a clean, definitive ending, one where nobody else could repurpose or degrade what Little House had built. So no, the network didn't cancel the show because of the explosion, and the explosion didn't get the show pulled off the air either. The series had already been wound down due to declining ratings well before that finale ever aired. The dynamite wasn't a punishment. It was Landon's answer to an ending that was coming no matter what he did. Over the decades, though, the story has drifted further from the facts every time it gets retold. Because the finale was rarely rerun in syndication, being far heavier and less feel-good than a typical episode, many younger fans only ever heard about it secondhand. That gap between the show's reputation as comfort television and this genuinely startling final act helped the myth grow that the episode had somehow been suppressed or banned. In truth, it aired. It was even repeated a handful of times, and the destruction of Walnut Grove has simply become one of those pop culture stories that gets more dramatic with every retelling. Before we get into the heavier behind-the-scenes drama, it's worth pausing on some of the smaller, funnier details that slipped past the editors over 9 seasons of production. Take the pacing of Laura's pregnancy in Season 7. Viewers have long noticed that despite scenes clearly staged in blooming spring weather, Laura seems to remain visibly pregnant well into what should have been the following summer. Fans have joked for years that time simply moves differently on the prairie. Then there's Nellie Oleson's signature ringlets. Alison Arngrim's tight golden curls weren't natural at all. They came from a wig secured to her scalp with metal combs and pins, a process uncomfortable enough that it reportedly left her scalp irritated on more than one occasion. Perhaps the most cited blooper of the entire series involves a very out-of-place guest star. In the Season 8 episode, Wave of the Future, a character clearly modeled on Colonel Sanders shows up to pitch a fried chicken business to the town, decades before that kind of fast food franchising existed on the American frontier. It's a fun, if slightly jarring, reminder that the show occasionally prioritized a good story beat over strict historical accuracy. There were also plenty of quieter costuming slip-ups, modern bra silhouettes peeking through period dresses, hairstyles that leaned more disco-era than 1870s Homestead, and a near-total absence of the facial hair that would have been common on frontier men at the time. Add in a visible stunt dummy during a train sequence, and you've got a show that, for all its careful period detail, still had the occasional very human production hiccup. The set also quietly launched a few future A-list careers. Sean Penn made an early screen appearance on the show, as did Jason Bateman, both years before either became a household name in Hollywood. And in the finale itself, eagle-eyed fans have pointed out that even though The Last Farewell is set years after the main series, none of the residents seem to have aged, a subtle reminder that television time doesn't always match up with story time. None of these details take away from what the show accomplished. If anything, they're a reminder that even a meticulously produced period drama is still the product of real people working long hours under real constraints, and that a handful of charming mistakes tend to sneak through no matter how careful a production tries to be. To really understand how Little House ended the way it did, you have to understand the person running it. Michael Landon wasn't simply the star of the show. As the head writer, frequent director, and executive producer, he had more creative authority over Little House than almost any actor had over a network drama at that time. That level of control is exactly why the show could go as dark and as ambitious as it did. It's also why the tensions on set so often led straight back to him. One of the earliest and most consequential conflicts was with Ed Friendly, the show's co-creator. Friendly had helped shepherd the series to television in the first place, envisioning a more traditional, book-faithful family drama. Landon had different plans. He wanted to push into heavier territory than Friendly was comfortable with, and as Landon's creative footprint grew, Friendly's influence over the show shrank until he was effectively pushed out of the production entirely. Landon's relationship with Karen Grassel, who played Caroline Ma Ingalls, was also far more complicated than the loving on-screen marriage suggested. Grassel has spoken about feeling underpaid relative to her male co-star and undervalued in the writer's room, describing Landon as someone who could be magnetic and difficult to work for in equal measure. She's also recalled moments of crude, demeaning humor on set that she found humiliating at the time. It's a strange contrast, a show built around the sanctity of family and mutual respect, produced in an environment where at least one of its central actors didn't always feel respected herself. That contrast between on-screen values and off-screen reality became even more pointed once Landon began an affair with Cindy Clerico, a young stand-in and makeup artist on the production, while he was still married to his second wife, Marjorie Lynn No. Clerico had originally been hired as a stand-in for Melissa Sue Anderson, and according to Karen Grassel's memoir, the rest of the cast slowly pieced together what was happening as Landon's behavior on set noticeably shifted. The affair strained his friendships with several castmates who knew and cared about his first family, and it reportedly cost him some of his outside endorsement deals as well. Landon and No divorced in 1982, and he married Clerico the following year in a small ceremony, with Clerico pregnant with their first child at the time. The couple remained together for the rest of Landon's life. Melissa Gilbert, who had grown especially close to Landon after the death of her own adoptive father, took the betrayal personally. She'd viewed him as something close to a father figure, and the affair fractured that trust for years. The two didn't fully reconcile until a surprise joint appearance on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson in 1991, just about a week before Landon's death from pancreatic cancer that July. It's a lot to absorb, and it complicates the tidy image of Landon as simply the beloved patriarch of American television. He clearly had an enormous positive influence on the careers of the young actors he mentored, and many cast members have spoken warmly about what he taught them. But he was also, by multiple accounts, a demanding, sometimes intimidating boss, and a man whose personal choices caused real, lasting pain to the people closest to him. Not every tension on set was personal, though. Some of it was simply the byproduct of a demanding shooting schedule, sweltering outdoor locations, heavy period costumes, long hours, and the emotional toll of playing characters who were constantly grieving, struggling, or suffering on screen. Melissa Sue Anderson, who played Mary Ingalls, has described the experience as both exhausting and rewarding in roughly equal measure, a fair summary of what it apparently felt like to work on the show at all. That same tension between the warm on-screen family and the more complicated reality behind it extended to the relationship between the show's two most prominent young actresses. Despite playing devoted sisters for years, Melissa Gilbert and Melissa Sue Anderson were reportedly never close off camera. Gilbert wrote candidly in her memoir, Prairie Tale, about feeling a persistent coldness from her co-star, and Alison Arngrim has separately recalled being warned early on to be wary of Anderson. It's a small but telling detail, two performers who convinced audiences they were inseparable while privately keeping each other at arm's length the entire time. And then, of course, there was the ongoing tug-of-war with NBC itself. As ratings declined in the final seasons, the network wanted to move on. Landon believed the show still had life left in it if given the right stories. Eventually, the two sides settled on a compromise: end the flagship series after its 9th season, then continue briefly with a spin-off, Little House, A New Beginning, which shifted focus to Laura and Almanzo. Without Landon at the creative center, that spin-off lasted only a single season before it, too, came to an end. It's not hard to see how that ongoing friction with the network shaped Landon's determination to end the original show entirely on his own terms, dynamite and all. For a series so often remembered as comforting old-fashioned family viewing, Little House on the Prairie repeatedly waded into subject matter that would raise eyebrows on a family show even today. The clearest example is the two-part Season 7 storyline centered on a character named Sylvia, a shy teenage girl who is sexually assaulted by a masked attacker and becomes pregnant as a result. For a primetime family drama in the late 1970s, this was extraordinarily heavy material. The storyline dealt directly with trauma, shame, and the stigma faced by unmarried pregnant women at the time, and it drew a wave of complaints from parents who felt it was inappropriate content for a show marketed to children. Decades later, opinions on the arc remain split. Some view it as a genuinely brave attempt to address a subject other shows wouldn't touch, while others still see it as tonally jarring for the audience the show was supposedly built for. Romantic storylines involving age gaps between characters have also aged uncomfortably. The relationship between Laura Ingalls and Almanzo Wilder, historically accurate to the real Wilder family, nonetheless put a 15-year-old Melissa Gilbert opposite a 23-year-old Dean Butler during the Sweet 16 storyline. At the time, this was largely accepted as an innocent, faithful adaptation of the source material. Viewed through a modern lens, with heightened awareness of power dynamics on set and the responsibility productions have toward protecting young performers, the choice reads very differently. Gilbert herself has spoken about how uncomfortable and exposed she felt filming romantic scenes with an adult actor at that age. A similar dynamic shows up in an early Season 2 episode where Nellie Olson, played by a 13-year-old Alison Arngrim, becomes the object of romantic interest from an older teenage boy. What may have played as harmless, even comedic, material at the time reads as far more uncomfortable by today's standards. The show also tackled race directly, most notably in the Season 3 episode, The Wisdom of Solomon, which follows a young black boy who asks the Ingalls family to adopt him because he believes it will give him a better life than staying in his own community. Some viewers praised the episode for confronting racial inequality head-on at a time when many family shows avoided the topic entirely. Others have criticized it for filtering the issue almost entirely through a white family's perspective, and for wrapping a genuinely difficult subject in an overly sentimental resolution that softened its harder edges. Taken together, these storylines complicate the wholesome nostalgia reputation that Little House has carried for decades. The show clearly wasn't afraid to put difficult, adult subject matter in front of a family audience, and for its era, that was a genuinely bold creative choice. At the same time, several of those same choices, particularly around age and consent, simply would not survive contact with modern standards for protecting young performers and handling sensitive subject matter responsibly. When Little House on the Prairie first premiered, it was marketed and largely received as safe, moral, old-fashioned family entertainment, a comforting alternative at a time when much of network television was leaning into grittier, more cynical storytelling. Families tuned in loyally for years, the show consistently ranked among the most watched programs on television during its early seasons, and syndication later introduced the Ingalls family to entirely new generations of viewers who hadn't been alive for the original broadcast. Critical opinion was more divided than the audience's affection for it. Some critics praised the show's willingness to tackle more complex material than its family-friendly reputation suggested, pointing to episodes like The Wisdom of Solomon and the Sylvia arc as evidence the show was more ambitious than it got credit for. Others accused Landon of leaning too heavily on melodrama, manipulating audiences with swelling music and tearful performances until the show tipped, in their eyes, into pure sentimentality. As the years passed and Melissa Gilbert in particular opened up about the emotional demands of playing Laura, the conversation around the show shifted again. She's described being nicknamed One Take Gilbert on set for her ability to cry convincingly on command, a small detail that speaks to just how emotionally demanding the role was for a child actress carrying that much of the show's dramatic weight. More recently, as television as a medium has grown far more comfortable depicting trauma, identity, and systemic inequality directly, Little House has been reassessed by critics and longtime fans alike as having been ahead of its time in some respects, even as certain storylines are now viewed as clumsy or uncomfortable by contemporary standards. That reassessment became especially visible when talk of a modern reboot picked up in the 2010s and again in the 2020s, with some original cast members pushing back on the idea that the source material needed to be modernized at all, arguing the original series had already broken new ground decades before television was widely comfortable doing so. So, did the infamous demolition of Walnut Grove get Little House on the Prairie canceled? Not really. The show's ending had already been decided by the time that finale was written, driven by ordinary television economics. Ratings had dropped, and NBC wanted to move on. What Michael Landon did was take a mandatory, contractually required teardown of an aging set and turn it into one of the most talked-about endings in television history. It's a fitting final act for a show that spent 9 seasons refusing to take the easy way out. Little House on the Prairie told stories about grief, addiction, racism, sexual violence, and quiet resilience decades before those subjects became common territory for network drama. It also, by numerous cast accounts, operated behind the scenes with real tension, unequal treatment, and personal betrayals that stood in sharp contrast to the family values the show preached on screen. Maybe that contradiction is part of why the show still gets talked about more than 40 years later. It promised comfort and delivered something messier, more honest, and considerably more complicated than pure nostalgia. Somewhere between the dynamite in that final scene and the quiet dysfunction happening off-camera, Little House on the Prairie turned out to be a far stranger, richer story than the gentle prairie drama it's remembered as. What's your take? Did Michael Landon make the right call by blowing up Walnut Grove, or should the show have gone out with a gentler goodbye? Let us know in the comments, and thanks for watching.